Hi, this presentation is about trends in reading. Specifically, it will focus on pedagogical principles for K-12 ELL reading instruction. First, reading comprehension for English language learners has been shown to be consistently lower than reading comprehension for students who speak English as their first language. This is shown in the chart here. The bottom line shows the reading comprehension for ELL students. The top line is the comprehension growth for EL1 students. This variance in reading skills was found as early as kindergarten. Huang and Quinault advocated for early intervention to support these students and to hopefully lower the gap in reading comprehension between ELL and EL1 students. Furthermore, students who lived in different home language environments had different reading achievement growth patterns. This is demonstrated in the graph here, which shows mastery patterns of vocabulary knowledge in terms of reading comprehension. There are 4 groups noted on this graph. The first one is EN, which refers to students who hear and speak English only at home. The next group, EQ, refers to students who hear and speak both English and another language equally. OT talks about students who hear and speak another language only at home. Finally, EQEN are for students who hear both languages but speak English only at home. Here we see 2 more graphs. The first one is about mastery patterns of grammatical knowledge for reading comprehension, and the second is for skill mastery patterns of textually implicit comprehension for reading. As you can see, differences in reading achievement disappeared the longer students stayed in a target language community. So although students start out with different reading skills here, by the end of the 5-year period, they're basically in the same place. Interestingly, multilingual students actually demonstrated a higher mastery of reading by the end of the 5-year period. This demonstrated that different home languages did not actually impede reading achievement in the long run. However, more in-depth studies did find significant differences between the groups of ELL and EL1 comprehension for reading. For example, Crossan and Luceau explored the role of connectives in reading comprehension. Connectives are words such as meanwhile, although, and besides. They found that the understanding of connectives explained variance in comprehension for EL1s, but not for ELLs. This means that for students who speak English as their first language, if they have a poor understanding of connectives, such as meanwhile, although, or besides, they are likely to have poor reading comprehension skills as well. This correlation was not shown with ELLs, and this demonstrates that there is a difference between these groups in terms of reading comprehension. Because of the difference between ELL and EL1 reading comprehension, many researchers have looked into the right pedagogical techniques for supporting ELL readers. According to the Common Core, they want all students to be able to read and comprehend complex literary and informational texts independently and proficiently. Because Common Core is so prevalent in today's school systems, many researchers have looked at this requirement for students. For example, one article looked at complex texts. They wanted to see exactly what Common Core meant by the term complex texts, and they figured out that complex texts are determined by more than just textual features. In fact, they require higher and deeper thinking. So, they asserted that text should not always be simplified for ELLs. If instructors do this, then ELLs are missing out on important opportunities to build reading strategies. So, ELLs should actually be given rich and complex texts, just like their EL1 peers. So how do instructors ensure that ELLs can understand these texts? Instead of simplifying the texts, teachers should actually support ELL reading by building on their prior knowledge. And how do teachers build on students' prior knowledge? One way to do this is through vocabulary building. In a study done by Leacox and Jackson, they figured out that ELLs benefited from explicit vocabulary instruction. In their study, there was an intervention group and a control group. The intervention group read an ebook, and in these books, there were previews of target vocabulary words. In addition, there were also Spanish vocabulary definitions that were embedded in the book. In contrast, the control group read print books, and they were only exposed to incidental vocabulary. The results showed that the intervention group had bigger gains in word learning. The results of this study are slightly controversial, however. There are obviously multiple variables going on here. So the reason for the difference between the two groups might not have been just because of the difference in vocabulary exposure. It could also have been due to the fact that the intervention group read an ebook and the control group read a print book. Another researcher that looked at the issue of ELL readers understanding literature was James. She wrote an article entitled "The Honey Ant Readers: An Innovative and Bold Approach to Engaging Rural Indigenous Students in Print Literacy Through Accessible, Culturally, and Linguistically Appropriate Resources." So she wondered why researchers were spending this time trying to figure out how to get students to understand readings that were not culturally relevant to them. And she decided instead to create readings that were culturally relevant to the students who were reading them. The first line from her article is, "On entering school, rural Australian children from Indigenous backgrounds are thrown into an unfamiliar environment, linguistically and culturally, which sets them up for failure." So James wanted to explore how to avoid this failure for these Indigenous students. What she did was create readers that were specifically designed for rural Indigenous learners. The purpose of the readers was to teach reading and standard Australian English to speakers of Aboriginal English. How? By using relevant content with Indigenous themes, stories, and characters. A more in-depth look at the readers reveals that the language was scaffolded across the books in these ways. First, the language transitions from Aboriginal English to Standard Australian English. It does this in a way that follows the rules of second language acquisition. So, the language used goes from generally simple terms to more complex terms. Then, the themes and stories in the book are all from Indigenous Aboriginal culture. In addition, the characters are referred to by their family role, not their names. These are just some examples of how these readers were designed to be more culturally relevant for the Aboriginal Indigenous students. The results of this study showed that students did actually relate more to the subject material. This caused them to have increased interest in reading, and that led to students actually starting to read faster. So, important points to remember about supporting reading comprehension for ELLs. First, it is not always better to give ELLs simplified texts. They could be missing out on learning important reading strategies that their peers are getting. Instead, it's better to build on the prior knowledge of ELLs. One way to do this is by explicitly teaching vocabulary. Finally, it's a good idea to use reading materials that have relevant content for your learners. This will help them to be more motivated to read and can actually, by increasing their interest in reading, can actually speed up their learning. These are my references for the presentation. Thank you for watching.